Standing on the banks of a slow-moving creek in the heart of Clay County, Kentucky. It's quiet here, peaceful. The only sounds are the rustle of leaves in the poplar trees and the gentle murmur of water flowing over smooth gray stones. But this place holds a violent secret. If you stand here long enough and you listen past the wind, you can almost hear a different sound. The echo of a quiet morning being torn apart by a dozen rifles firing all at once. It was right here, on this ground, that one of the most feared men in Appalachian history drew his last breath. His name was Thomas Baker, but no one called him that. They called him Bad Tom. For years, he was a ghost in these hills, a peerless marksman who seemed untouchable. Today, we're going to piece together the lost story of how a man like that ended up here, ambushed and alone, with nothing in his hand but a bar of soap. We're here to listen to the whispers from the past. To understand the man, you have to understand the world that forged him. Let's wind the clock back, long before that morning at the creek, to the years after the Civil War. Clay County wasn't a peaceful place then. It was a hornet's nest. The war between the states hadn't washed this land clean. It had just given old grudges a new flag to hide behind. Neighbor had fought neighbor in brutal guerrilla bands, and when the official armies went home, the bitterness remained, thick and suffocating as the summer fog in these hollows. In this world, the law from the state capital was a distant rumor. The real law was kinship. Your family name was your shield, your jury, and your executioner. A man's honor wasn't just a word. It was the most valuable thing he owned, and an insult was a debt that could only be paid in blood. This was a land of hard men, where disputes were settled not with lawsuits, but with long rifles and steady hands. At the center of this world stood the Howard clan. They were a powerful family, deeply rooted in the soil of Clay County, their influence tied to the wealth of the Goose Creek salt works. They were proud, numerous, and saw themselves as the rightful leaders of the region. They were men who expected respect and were quick to answer any perceived challenge to their authority. To them, the county had a natural order, and they were at the top of it. And then there was Thomas Baker. He was a different kind of force, a Union veteran who had walked through the fire of the war and come out the other side harder than mountain stone. He wasn't loud or boastful. He was a man of few words, with what people called a cold, glittering eye that seemed to look right through you. He was a hunter, and his time in the army had perfected his aim to a terrifying degree. He moved with a quiet confidence that some saw as arrogance, a challenge to the old ways. You could feel the tension crackle in the air on court days in Manchester. The Howards and their kin would stand on one side of the dusty street, and Tom Baker and his family would stand on the other. They were like two storm fronts gathering on opposite sides of a valley, dark and heavy with unspoken threats. Everyone knew it wasn't a matter of if the storm would break, but when. All it would take was a single spark to ignite an inferno that would consume them all. Feuds like this don't just appear out of thin air. They start with a single moment, a single choice. But the real reason, the human reason, often gets buried under decades of hearsay and legend. To find the truth, you have to dig. So I went to the local archives, to the place where old stories go to be forgotten, and I started scrolling through the ghosts of old newspapers on a dusty microfilm reader. After hours of searching, I found it. It's not much to look at. A faded column in an 1888 edition of a local paper, the text blurry at the edges. The headline is simple, almost sterile. Man shot and killed at logging camp. There's no picture, just a few short paragraphs. But this small, forgotten piece of newsprint is the Rosetta Stone of the Baker-Howard feud. The article reports that a man named Abner Eversole was killed by Thomas Baker following a dispute. It mentions cards and it mentions liquor. But the key detail, the one that tells you this wasn't just some drunken brawl, is Eversole's family name. He was a Howard kinsman. This wasn't a murder, it was an assassination. This small article is the official declaration of war, printed in black and white for all the world to see. But this yellowed paper, for all its facts, leaves the most important question unanswered. It tells us what happened, but it doesn't tell us why. What was the argument really about? The paper just says a dispute, but a dispute doesn't start a war that will last for over a decade and claim dozens of lives. To find that answer, we have to go back to the logging camp itself and listen to what the official record left out. Let's travel back to that logging camp in 1888. Picture a rough-hewn bunkhouse, smelling of pine sap, sweat, and cheap whiskey. A game of cards is underway by lantern light, a circle of hard men who worked with their hands all day and gambled with their pay at night. On one side of the table sat Tom Baker, on the other, Abner Eversole and a few of his Howard cousins. The air was already thick with a tension that had little to do with the cards being dealt. The game got heated, as it always did when liquor and pride were on the table. An argument started over a disputed pot. Eversole, maybe feeling brave with his kinsman beside him, pointed a finger at Baker and accused him of cheating. The other men fell silent. It was a dangerous accusation to level against any man in that camp, but to say it to Tom Baker was like throwing a lit match into a barrel of gunpowder. But it wasn't just about the cards. A darker rumor had been festering in the county for weeks, a whisper that Tom Baker had stolen a pig from a Howard family homestead. In a place where livestock was a family's wealth and a man's reputation was everything, this was the gravest of insults. It branded him a common thief. And now, in the middle of the tense bunkhouse, Eversole made the fatal mistake of saying the quiet part out loud. He threw the accusation of the stolen pig right in Baker's face. The room went dead still. This was the moment, the point of no return. Tom Baker didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply pushed his chair back and stood up. In a voice that was low and steady, a voice colder than a winter creek, he looked Eversole in the eye, denied the charge, and demanded he take it back. For a long second, Abner Eversole had a choice: swallow his pride and live, or stand his ground and die. Emboldened by his friends and the whiskey burning in his gut, he made his choice. He refused to apologize, and his hand went for the pistol at his belt. He never cleared the holster. Baker's draw was a single fluid motion, a flash of steel and a deafening roar that shook the tiny bunkhouse. Abner Eversole crumpled to the floor. The card game was over, and the story behind that brief newspaper article was written in blood. Paper records and newspaper clippings can only tell you so much. They give you the bones of a story, but not the heart. To find that, you have to talk to the people who carry the story in their blood. I found James Baker sitting on the front porch of his small house, tucked away on a ridge overlooking the same hills his infamous ancestor once roamed. He's a man in his 80s now, with his great-grandfather's clear, steady eyes and hands weathered by a lifetime of working this land. He offered me a seat and listened patiently as I explained what I was doing. He'd heard it all before, from reporters, from authors, from curious outsiders. He nodded slowly, a tired smile playing on his lips. "You've been reading the books," he said, his voice a low Appalachian drawl. "They all talk about a stolen pig. They make my great-grandfather out to be a common thief who killed a man over a card game. That's the story the Howards wanted everyone to believe. It's cleaner that way." Then he leaned forward in his rocking chair, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that spanned a century. "But the story my father told me, the one his father told him, is different. There was no stolen pig. That was a lie, a slander cooked up by the Howards because Tom was becoming too well respected, and they couldn't stand it. They wanted to tear down his name. My great-grandfather," he continued, his voice dropping, "was not a man who started fights, but he was damn sure a man who finished them. In that logging camp, Abner Eversole didn't just accuse him of stealing. He'd been drinking, and he got mean. He looked Tom square in the face, and he said something vile about his wife, Mary. An insult so foul that in those days, for a man to say that about another man's wife, there was only one possible answer. It wasn't a choice, it was a duty. Hearing him say that, the whole story shifted. The dusty newspaper article felt hollow, incomplete. This wasn't a feud over property or a card game. According to the Baker family, this was about a sacred line being crossed. A husband defending his wife's honor in the only way his world understood. Suddenly, Tom Baker wasn't just a killer. He was an avenger. Let's go back inside that cramped, smoky bunkhouse. The argument over the cards and the stolen pig was just the kindling. Abner Eversole, full of liquor and backed by his kin, decided to throw gasoline on the fire. He looked Tom Baker dead in the eye, and the words that came out of his mouth were not about cheating or theft. They were a vile personal attack aimed squarely at Tom's wife, Mary. It was a poisoned dart of an insult designed to strip a man of his dignity in front of his peers, to stain the one thing in his life he held sacred. The air in the room was sucked out in an instant. The other men froze, their eyes wide. This was no longer a squabble. This was a line being crossed, a taboo violated. In the code of the mountains, you could challenge a man's strength, his word, even his life. But you did not speak ill of his wife. To do so was to invite death to your door. Everyone in that room knew that Abner Eversole had just signed his own death warrant. Tom Baker's reaction was terrifying in its stillness. There was no explosion of rage, no shouted curses. A deep, cold calm settled over him. He slowly pushed his chair back from the rough plank table and rose to his full height. His face was a mask of stone, and that glittering eye of his was fixed on Eversole, not with anger, but with a kind of finality, like a judge who has already passed sentence. In a voice that cut through the silence, he said, "Take it back." It wasn't a request, it was an order. One last chance to step back from the abyss. But Eversole was trapped. His pride, the whiskey, and the watching eyes of his cousins had him in a corner. To back down now would be to live with the shame forever. He likely let out a sneer, a drunken laugh, and doubled down on his insult. His hand, clumsy and slow, dropped to the butt of his pistol. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Before Eversole's fingers could even get a proper grip, Tom Baker's hand moved. It wasn't a frantic motion. It was a blur of practiced economy, a movement he had honed in the chaos of war and the solitude of the hunt. The gunshot wasn't just a sound. It was a physical blow that slammed into the walls of the small room. Abner Eversole was thrown backward, the look of shock permanently etched on his face as he hit the floor. Tom Baker stood for a moment in the ringing silence, the smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. He didn't look at the other men. He simply holstered his weapon, turned, and walked out into the night. He knew what he had just done. He hadn't just ended a man's life. He had sounded the first trumpet of a long and bloody war. From that moment on, there would be no apologies, no truces, and no peace. There would only be the feud. The killing of Abner Eversole lit the fuse. What followed was an explosion of violence that turned Clay County into a war zone. The feud spilled out of the isolated hollers and into the streets, and the epicenter of it all was right here, where I'm standing now, the town square in Manchester. Today, it's a peaceful place. Cars pass by, people go in and out of the shops. It's hard to imagine it as anything else. But if you walk with me over to the old courthouse, a proud red brick building that has seen more history than any person alive, and you run your hand along the wall facing the street, you'll feel it. The surface isn't smooth. It's dotted with small dark pockmarks, little craters where the brick has been chipped away. Most people probably walk past these scars every day and never give them a second thought. But these aren't from weather or age. Right here. This is where it happened. Each of these marks is a silent testament to the chaos, a bullet hole left from a day when this town square was a free fire zone. This place, the very symbol of law and order in the county, became a hunting ground. The courthouse steps were turned into a fortress, and men used wagons and street corners as cover while they waged their private war in public, with no regard for who was caught in the crossfire. We're about to go back to one of those days, to a moment when the gunfire was so intense its echoes are still trapped in this very brick. Imagine a stiflingly hot court day in Manchester. The town square is crowded, but it's a tense, watchful crowd. The unwritten rule on these days was that the town itself was neutral ground, but nobody believed it. Men with rifles leaned against porch posts, their eyes never still. The Bakers and their allies gathered near the livery stable. The Howards and their faction stood in a tight knot on the courthouse steps, a clear claim to the seat of power. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came in the most ordinary way. A Howard man coming down the steps bumped hard into a Baker cousin going up. Words were exchanged, a curse muttered under the breath. A hand moved instinctively toward a pistol grip, not to draw, but as a warning. It was a fatal gesture. A sharp crack echoed off the brick facade, and the first man stumbled backward, a look of disbelief on his face. In a heartbeat, the square erupted. It wasn't a battle, it was a maelstrom of chaos, the deep boom of rifles mixed with the sharp bark of revolvers. Men who had been neighbors dove for cover behind horse troughs and wooden wagons, which offered little protection. Wood splintered, and the high-pitched whine of ricochets filled the air. Puffs of red dust exploded from the courthouse wall as stray bullets found their mark, carving the very scars we can still see today. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder and fear. From the center of it all, Wilson Howard, the patriarch of his clan, tried to bring order to the chaos, shouting directions to his men. He was a commanding figure, a rock in the middle of a violent storm. He stood his ground, a symbol of his family's defiance and power, directing the fire from the top of the stone steps. It made him a leader. It also made him a target. Across the square, from the relative safety of a doorway, Tom Baker raised his long rifle. He was not a man for chaotic firefights. He was a hunter, a marksman. For him, this wasn't a brawl. It was a series of calculations. He rested the barrel, took a breath to steady his hands, and squeezed the trigger. There was no wasted motion. A single, heavier crack cut through the din. Wilson Howard, who a moment before had been a pillar of command, suddenly stiffened. His rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering on the stone steps. He didn't cry out. He simply looked down at his own chest with a look of profound surprise before he folded, collapsing in a heap at the feet of his kin. The sight of their fallen leader broke the Howards' charge. A stunned silence fell over their side of the fight. The firing sputtered and died out as they rushed to drag his body out of the line of fire, their retreat a panicked scramble. The Bakers held their ground, watching them go. The fight was over as suddenly as it had begun. All that was left was the thick blue haze of smoke hanging in the silent air, the glint of brass casings on the dusty ground, and the new dark holes in the courthouse wall. After a storm of violence like the one that swept through Manchester, the official machinery of the law begins to grind, slowly and often ineffectively. And it leaves behind a paper trail. I'm holding a copy of the coroner's inquest into the death of Wilson Howard. It's a formal document, written in a looping bureaucratic script that tries to impose order on a day of pure chaos. You read through the dry, legalistic language, and it feels like it's describing a different event entirely. It lists the deceased, Wilson Howard. It notes the location, the town square. Then you get to the most important part, the cause of death. It simply says, "Deceased came to his end by means of a gunshot wound." That's it. A few simple words to sanitize a brutal public execution. There's no mention of the dozens of other shots fired, of the terror, of the fact that the town's main street was turned into a battlefield. Then you look at the indictments that were handed down by the grand jury in the following weeks. And there, among a list of names from the Baker clan, is the one that mattered most. Thomas Baker. On this piece of paper, he's just another name, a defendant in a murder case. The document doesn't tell you that he was a legend, that his single calculated shot had decapitated the rival clan in broad daylight. It reduces the most dramatic moment of the entire feud to a line of ink on a page. This is the official truth, the version of the story that's written down in the county archives. But it's a sterile, bloodless truth. It's a lie by omission. Because in the mountains of Clay County, an indictment from a courthouse in Manchester was one thing. Getting a man like Tom Baker to stand for trial was another thing entirely. The law had pointed its finger at him, and now it had to come into the hills and get him. That piece of paper, the indictment, was a challenge. And so the law, slow and uncertain, sent a posse into the hills to retrieve Tom Baker. But this was not their world. They were men of the town, sent into a labyrinth of creeks and hollers where every tree could hide a rifleman and every shadow felt like a threat. They were hunting a legend in his own kingdom, and they knew it. Tom Baker wasn't hiding. He was simply gone, absorbed back into the landscape that had made him. The posse would ride for days, finding nothing but cold campfires and tracks that vanished on stony ground. The locals they questioned would meet their eyes with a vacant, unhelpful stare. No one had seen Tom Baker. No one knew anything. But the posse felt his presence everywhere. They felt it in the snap of a twig in the woods just beyond their camp at night, in the unnerving silence of the forest. They weren't the hunters here. They were the hunted, trespassing in a land that answered to a different authority. The manhunt was a failure before it even began. Then, just as the law was about to give up, Tom Baker did the last thing anyone expected. He walked out of the hills on his own. He strode into the center of Manchester, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, and turned himself in to the sheriff. It wasn't a surrender, it was a strategic move. He knew he couldn't be caught, but living as a fugitive put his family in constant danger. By facing the court, he was taking control of the narrative, daring the system to try and hold him. The trial was a spectacle of fear. The small courthouse was packed, but it was divided down the middle like a church at a funeral. On one side sat the Baker clan, their faces hard and unreadable, their hands never far from the pistols concealed beneath their coats. On the other side sat the Howards, their eyes burning with a cold fire of hatred and grief. Between them sat a terrified judge and a jury of 12 local men who knew with absolute certainty that their decision would have consequences far beyond the courtroom walls. Witnesses mumbled, their memories suddenly foggy. Evidence seemed to disappear. The prosecution's case, so clear on paper, began to fall apart under the crushing weight of unspoken threats. The jury didn't deliberate for long. They were farmers and merchants, not martyrs. They had to live in this county. When they filed back in, the foreman wouldn't look at the Howard family. In a quiet, nervous voice, he delivered the verdict: not guilty. The shooting of Wilson Howard was ruled an act of self-defense. A low murmur went through the room. Tom Baker stood, nodded once to the jury, and walked out of the courthouse a free man, his legal innocence now as much a part of his legend as his marksmanship. The Howards were left with nothing but rage. The law had failed them. Their patriarch was dead, and his killer had walked away without consequence. They knew then that if they wanted justice, they would have to get it themselves, not with indictments, but with bullets. Every story eventually ends in the same place. I'm standing in a quiet cemetery on a hillside just outside Manchester. The wind whispers through the cedar trees, and the old tombstones lean at odd angles, their inscriptions softened and blurred by a century of rain and sun. This is where the old names of Clay County come to rest. The names of farmers, merchants, mothers, children, and the names of feuding warriors. Over here, beneath a thick, respectable slab of granite, lies Wilson Howard. The stone is weathered, but it was clearly expensive for its time, a final statement of his status as the patriarch of a powerful clan. It speaks of a man of substance, a leader of the community. There's an air of tragic dignity to it. the resting place of a man whose death was never truly avenged by the law. And then, if you walk just 50 yards down the slope, you'll find another stone. It's simpler, more rugged, cut from local stone. The name carved into it is clear and deep: Thomas Baker, 1845 to 1899. Seeing them here so close together is a profound and bitter irony. They lie just 100 yards apart now, these mortal enemies, closer in death than they ever were in life. They fought a war for control of these hills, and in the end, they each got a small, quiet piece of them forever. But standing here, looking at Tom Baker's grave, a critical question hangs in the air. The trial for Wilson Howard's death was years before 1899. He walked out of that courthouse a free man, legally untouchable. So why is this his final resting place? What happened in those intervening years that drove the Howards' hatred to a point where a courtroom acquittal meant nothing, and the only verdict they would accept was one delivered from the barrel of a gun? Tom Baker walked out of that courthouse a free man, but he wasn't free. The verdict was just a piece of paper. The real sentence had been passed in the hearts of the Howard family. For them, the trial wasn't an acquittal. It was a final, bitter confirmation that the law of the state was useless. Their patriarch was gone, and the man who killed him now walked the streets of Manchester with the government's blessing. Their rage didn't cool. It settled into something harder and colder, a patient hatred that would wait years for its moment. The feud entered a new grinding phase. It was no longer a war of open battles in the town square, but a war of shadows. The Howards set ambushes for Tom, but he seemed to possess a sixth sense for danger, an almost animal instinct that would make him change his path at the last second or melt back into the woods just as a trap was about to be sprung. His legend grew even larger. They said he was protected by something unnatural, that he had made a pact with the devil. But the truth was likely simpler. He was a man who had survived a war, and he knew how to live as if death was always a single step behind him. But even the most vigilant man can be worn down by time. The years passed. The open violence subsided into a tense, watchful peace. Tom Baker was still the most feared man in Clay County, but he was also a man trying to live a life. He had a home, he had a family, he was getting older. The constant threat became a part of the background noise of his life, a danger so familiar that it almost ceased to feel like danger at all. Perhaps he began to believe the worst was over, that the Howards, having failed so many times, had finally accepted that he was untouchable. He started to fall into routines, the small, daily habits that make up a normal life. And one of those routines was to walk down the familiar path from his cabin each morning to the creek, to wash the sleep from his eyes in the cool, clear water. It was a small act of peace in a life defined by violence. It was this routine, this small piece of normal life he reclaimed for himself, that would ultimately be his undoing. The Howards were watching, and they were patient. Even now, more than a century after the last shot was fired, the story of this feud is a living thing in Clay County. And like any living thing, it changes depending on the light you see it in. If you bring up the name Bad Tom Baker today, the answer you get depends entirely on who you ask. The war may be over, but the battle for the story continues. To the Baker family and their sympathizers, Tom is a figure of tragic frontier honor. He is the Union veteran who came home and refused to bow to the old powers of the county. He was a man who defended his wife's honor, who killed Wilson Howard in self-defense during a chaotic firefight, and who was ultimately the victim of a coward's ambush, shot down when he was unarmed and vulnerable. In their story, he is a folk hero, a testament to the mountain spirit of defiance. But if you talk to those whose families were allied with the Howards, you hear a much darker tale. In that version, Tom Baker wasn't a hero, he was a menace. A cold-blooded killer with ice in his veins and a hair-trigger temper who used his reputation to intimidate the whole county. They believe he murdered Abner Eversole over a card game, assassinated their leader in a calculated shot, and then used fear to cheat the law. To them, the final act at the creek wasn't a murder. It was an execution, the only form of justice left to them when the courts had failed. It was the necessary, brutal act of putting down a mad dog to bring peace to the community. So which story is the truth? Was he a righteous avenger or a ruthless killer? A protector of his family or a predator who terrorized his rivals? The honest answer is that the real Tom Baker is likely buried somewhere in the grey space between those two extremes, lost to time and loyalties. The facts are set in stone. The men who died, the trial, the ambush. But the meaning of those facts is still at war with itself, a conflict of memory passed down from one generation to the next. When a story is this big, this soaked in blood and pride, it doesn't stay history for long. As it gets passed down around kitchen tables and late-night campfires, it starts to shed its inconvenient facts, like a snake shedding its skin. What's left behind is something harder, smoother, and far more powerful: a legend. The feud between the Bakers and the Howards is no longer just a series of events. It's a foundational myth of Clay County. The character of Bad Tom Baker, in particular, grew larger than life. People needed a way to explain how one man could be so deadly, so seemingly untouchable for so long. And so, they whispered that his skill wasn't natural. The story of his rifle was born, the one that claimed he'd had a gunsmith inlay a silver coin into the front sight. They said the silver gave it an unholy accuracy, that it guided his bullets to their targets. The gun itself became a cursed object, and to this day, people speculate about where it might be, buried with him perhaps, to keep its dark magic from the world. And it wasn't just the man who became a legend. The feud itself took on a life of its own, seeping into the folklore of the mountains. A dark superstition took root in the community, a whisper that before every killing, a hoot owl would cry near the victim's cabin the night before. People claimed it was a death omen, the voice of the mountains themselves passing judgment. It was the community's way of processing the relentless, unpredictable violence by turning it into a supernatural force, a dark fate that could be read in the signs and sounds of the night. These tales are how a community makes sense of a trauma it can't forget. They are the final stage of a story's life, the moment it dissolves from hard history into the misty realm of legend. They serve as a warning, a ghost story to tell children about the price of pride and the darkness that can rise up between neighbors. The facts may fade, but the legend of Bad Tom Baker, his silver-sighted rifle, and the crying owl of death still haunts these hills. And so, we find ourselves back where we started, on the banks of this quiet creek. The water still murmurs over these smooth grey stones, just as it did on that morning in 1899. But the silence here feels different now. It's heavier. We came here hearing only the faint echo of a rifle volley, but we've followed that sound back through time, through courthouse shootouts and smoky bunkhouses, through conflicting memories and whispered legends. This spot is no longer just a peaceful place in the woods. It's the final page of a brutal chapter in this county's history. It's a testament to a world where a man's honor was worth more than his life, and a reminder that when people feel the law has abandoned them, they will make their own with fire and lead. The story of Tom Baker shows us that history is never a simple matter of heroes and villains. He was a man forged by a hard land and a violent time, and the truth of his life lies somewhere in the shadows between the legend and the reality. So the next time you pass a forgotten ruin on a lonely road, or a simple weathered tombstone on a quiet hillside, remember this place. Remember that it's not just a collection of stones or a patch of earth. It's a library filled with stories of love, loss, and the terrible choices that can define a generation. You just have to be willing to stop and to listen to the whispers. The people are gone, the guns are silent, but the story remains.